In this video, I'll be giving you my thoughts on the new 56mm f1.8 autofocus lens from TTArtisan. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'll be offering you my review of the TTArtisan 56mm f1.8 autofocus lens for Fujifilm X cameras. Now, I'm assuming that this will become available for other APS-C mounts in time, but for now, this is the Fujifilm X version. Now, this is the third lens that I've reviewed from TTArtisan, and this time around we have that sort of quote-unquote classic portrait focal length of 56mm, which is roughly the equivalent of an 85mm lens in full-frame format for those who like to convert between formats. Now, full disclosure before we get going, TTArtisan did send this for testing and for review, but they don't have any input on this review or get to see the video before it goes live. Now, all thoughts and opinions here are my own, and they're formed over the couple of months that I've had using this lens, but the only thing that you may see floating around the internet are a few images that I have provided to TTArtisan for their marketing purposes. Now, this wasn't a stipulation for sending over the lens for review, but it's just something that I decided I would do to help them promote this lens, which, as we will see, is quite a good offering on their end. This new lens looks and feels exactly like the 35mm f1.8 that TTArtisan sent over for testing last year, and that's definitely not a bad thing. Now, that lens feels refined and solid in the hand, and so does this one. So it seems that TTArtisan have sort of settled on a bit of a design language for their lenses going forward, which is really a great sign of things to come. Now, this lens does have a little bit more glass in it than the 35mm, so it is a little bit heavier at 234 grams, but it's still definitely very light. Now, unfortunately, there is still no physical aperturing here, so you will need to control the aperture from the camera body. Now, personally, I love having a physical aperture ring, as it just means that all the controls are right there with my two hands as I'm holding the camera, but I know a lot of people don't really mind, so your opinion on that may differ from mine. Now, the only real difference that I felt when working with this lens versus the 35mm lens was in the stiffness of the focus ring. Now, the 56mm is just that little bit looser, a little bit easier to turn, which I personally prefer. You don't really need to put quite as much effort into turning it, but it still does have good resistance and makes manual focusing easy if that's the way that you like to work. Now, just like with the 35mm, TTArtisan have included a good quality square lens hood in the box with the lens. Now, again, for me, I would rather have a round or a petal-shaped hood, just for those times when I do use a CPL filter and I can get easy access to it. But honestly, I don't use them all that often, and so it's not a huge deal to just remove this and then shade the lens with my hand. And finally, TTArtisan has also included the firmware update cap in the box again, which is great to see. Now, the pin layout is a little bit different from the one that came with the 35mm, but TTArtisan have told me that this is just an updated version, and they are backwards compatible, and this is the one that will come with lenses going forward. Now, these lens caps unfortunately don't fit onto Fujifilm's lenses, so what I've done is actually just replaced each one of these with a Fujifilm lens cap in my bag, so that it makes it easy to switch back and forth between Fujifilm lenses when I'm out in the field. And honestly, I'm never going to have the dying need to update my lenses firmware while I'm on a portrait session, so leaving this at home for when I actually need it isn't a huge issue. In my experience, TTArtisan's stepping motors are swift and mostly accurate. Now, this lens is essentially no different from the 35mm lens that I tested last year, and just like that lens, I've noticed a couple of slight misses from time to time, but maybe only 1 in 100 or so, so that could even just be down to the camera, its focusing system, or the light that we were in, and it being a little bit difficult for it to focus. But honestly, Fujifilm could sit up and take notice here. The XF56mm f1.2 is an absolutely amazing lens that is really let down by the DC coreless motor that they chose to use. And I'd like to say well done to TTArtisan for making use of a stepping motor here. The experience of working with this lens is far superior to Fujifilm's own offering just because of that focusing motor. So as you can see, the lens locks on really quickly without any hunting at all, and I've had no issues at all focusing the lens in the field, and I found that even in AFS, it's often quick enough that it will be able to, latch on to a walking person and get a quick shot without having to switch to AFC. But when working in AFC, it's also been really reliable and it tracks subjects very, very well. So there's not really much to talk about here. It just does the job and gets out of the way and allows you to continue with making images. In the center of the frame, this lens produces reasonably sharp images when used wide open. Now, it quickly improves by f2, and then it's at its best by f2.8. Now, given that a lot of people are going to be using this lens for portraiture, this is perfectly acceptable performance from a lens like this. The corners do lag a little bit behind the center, and even when stopped down, they never quite reach the level of detail that you'll find around the center of the frame. Now, again, from f2.8, they're quite good, and they're definitely usable for many types of photography. When compared to the much more expensive XF 56mm f1.2 RWR, we can see the differences quite clearly. The XF lens is sharper in the center at f1.2 than the TTArtisan is at f2.8. Now, the corners produced by the XF lens are also sharper as well. Now, that's not to say that the TTArtisan isn't a decent performer though, and I think a lot of people will be perfectly happy with this level of sharpness. Chromatic aberration is well controlled here. There's a little green and red fringing to be seen in extreme circumstances, but I've found that it's really not even noticeable until you actually zoom into the images in post. Now, even then, it's rare that there's much fringing at all. As a lens that's likely to see a lot of bokeh-driven backlit portraiture, this is a really great result. Flare and ghosting are generally well controlled when there are lights inside the frame or well and truly outside the frame. But once you have a bright light like the sun quite close to the edge of the frame, there is some fairly intense flare that occurs at times. Now, the first time that I noticed this was on my very first day of shooting with this lens, and I've been looking for it ever since. This is the kind of flare that I love to see from a lens. Now, it's almost like a circular wash that comes in from the direction of the light, and it reminds me a little bit of the type of flare that I get from some of Fujifilm's own lenses, like the XF 56mm or the GF 110mm f2. Now, it's a little bit more intense than those lenses at times, and a little bit less controlled, but I'll discuss more about that in the field section of this review, so do stick around for that. Bokeh from this lens is generally quite smooth. From f1.8 to f2.8, the aperture blades produce reasonably round circles and only a little bit of cat's eye towards the extreme corners. Now, from f4 and onwards, the bokeh balls start to take on the shape of the aperture blades just a little bit more. Now, what this translates to in practice is quite smooth bokeh with very little definition in it until we get to f4. It works really well even if there are busy scenes behind. Personally, I really like the way this bokeh renders, and I would be happy to use it in my day-to-day work as well as for personal projects. This lens produces a deep vignette that, when used wide open, darkens the far corners by just over a stop and then fades gradually into the center. Now, it's not too dark and it's easy to correct for, but it is very deep. The good news is that the vignette is almost imperceptible by f2.8 and it's completely gone by f4. Sunstars with this lens are nothing special. They begin to appear around f5.6 and they remain quite undefined throughout the rest of the aperture range. Most of my work with this lens has been on a trip to Japan with my wife, and also just as a walk-around lens here in Seoul. Now, to be honest, I haven't really even noticed that I've been using a lens other than my regular kit in any way except for the lack of an aperture ring, and that's a compliment. Once this lens is mounted to the camera, it just gets out of the way and does its job, and you really can't ask for much more than that. Now, one of my favorite things, as I said, has been working with this lens when it comes to having bright lights around the frame. I've really enjoyed working with the flare. Now, at very specific angles, you can achieve this sort of blooming from the direction of the light that adds a lovely feeling to the image, and that angle can be tough to find if you're working with an ever-changing composition though. When I was photographing my wife with the deer in Nara, I struggled a little bit to get the morning light to reliably produce the beautiful flare that I wanted, as we had wind blowing the trees and the deer and my wife were constantly moving, so I had a lot of images that had too much flare, images with the wrong angle that produced no flare, or produced a little bit of a sort of an ugly rainbow at the end of the flare, and then a few images where I managed to get everything just right, and it was absolutely worth doing that dance in the end. This flare is absolutely beautiful, and it really adds something special to the images in my opinion. The bokeh is also quite nice, which for someone like me who loves to, get in close and isolate a subject and just surround them in a sea of nice bokeh is a really good thing. Now, as I always seem to end up doing with a fast aperture lens, I found some nice bamboo leaves to photograph while I was in Japan, and I spent quite a bit of time dancing with the wind in order to combine that soft bokeh with the beautiful flare that I talked about from the early morning sun. The autofocus has also performed well during my time with this lens. It's been fast and almost always perfectly accurate. It simply does its job and lets you do yours. It gets out of the way, and that's honestly more than I can say for Fujifilm's own XF56mm with its DC cordless motor, which tends to just insert itself into your consciousness every now and again, remind you that it's there, and take you out of the moment of photography. The TTArtisan doesn't suffer from that, and it just sort of snaps into focus and lets you get on with your photography. So overall, I had absolutely no regrets taking this as one of my only lenses on the couple of trips that I've taken it on. It's small, it's lightweight, it just slips easily into a bag, but that wouldn't matter if it didn't deliver. And honestly, I've been really happy with, the level of sharpness, the bokeh, and also that really unique flare that you can get from it. In a nutshell, I'd say that this is an excellent option for a budget 56mm lens on the Fujifilm X system. Now, the significantly more expensive offerings from Fujifilm do have slightly smoother bokeh, they have slightly better sharpness all the way across the frame, they both have an aperture ring, and in the case of the new lens, we get weather sealing as well. But the TTArtisan does provide really nice bokeh, some interesting flare capabilities, much faster autofocus, and this is all in a smaller and lighter package than either of those lenses. Now, there are a few competitors out there in the third-party lens space, and if I can get a hold of them, I'd love to do sort of a roundup of all the 56mm lenses out there. But for now though, if you're looking for a lens at the budget end of the scale, this is a really great little lens that definitely deserves your attention. Now, as always, I hope that you've enjoyed this review, and please do let me know if you have any questions in the comments section below. Thanks again, and enjoy the slideshow.